Okay, friends. Last week we ran into a few incidences where I was asking you to compare fractions and the denominators were not the same. So today we're going to be looking at equivalent fractions and we're going to be looking at the lowest common denominator. But we're going to go through those two lessons and hopefully that'll give you a better understanding. I want you thinking about what the word equivalent means. Look at the first three letters. EQU. If you're thinking equal, you are correct. Okay, so this is very useful to compare using fraction strips, which I know is difficult seeing as how we're not at school and we do have fraction strips at school, but you can always Google, put into a Google search something like this. This is something that I want you to be looking for because it shows you and it compares all of the different fractions. Okay, but we'll go back to that. So this question is asking you to think about which is larger, which is a larger fraction, 3 over 4 or 8 over 9. When you can compare these two fraction strips, you can see as a visual which is larger. 8 over 9 is larger than 3 over 4. Okay, so going to look at this model, it shows you all of the equivalent fractions. So for instance, 1 whole, we know that means 1. 2 1/2 will give you 1 whole. In saying that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 quarters will give you 2 halves, will give you 1 whole. All of these are equivalent. In saying that, 2 1/4 is equivalent to 1/2. Okay? 1/5, not really equal if you look. There is no part of a fifth or 2/5 that are equal to 2 quarters or a quarter or a half. Okay, so when I say that, I'm looking at this. Let me grab a tool. Purple. Okay, so if I were to cut, you can clearly see that these are taking up the same amount of space. So I need 2 quarters, I need 1 and 2 to take up the same amount of space as this whole half. Does everybody see that? But I don't have any fifths that take up that same amount of space. No fifth takes up the same amount of space as any of the quarters or any of the halves. I know that I need to have all 5 in order to fill the space of a whole. Okay, oops. Sorry, there we go. No, I'm not even going to restart. Here we go. We have to fill in the blank areas. So we're starting with a whole, then we have halves, then we have quarters, then we have fifths. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So these strips are eighths. Okay, each of them represent 1/8. Do any fifths fit into eighths yet? I don't think so. While I'm doing this, I want you thinking about what that last strip, what the denominator is for that last strip. You're counting how many boxes are in that last strip. That's your denominator. So your denominator should be 10. Because you know that 5 fits equally into 10, right here, Okay, so then 1/10. So you're looking to see what are equivalent fractions. What takes up the same amount of space if I were to cut anywhere on this pyramid? So I can already tell you that 5/10, meaning these first 5, is equal to 1, 2, 3, 4/8, which is also equal to 2/4, which is also equal to 1/2. Does everybody see that? They all take up that same amount of space. If I were to draw this line straight down, all of these are taking up the same amount of space. 1/5 is the exception because it does not take up that same amount of space. Okay, here I want you thinking about what number you need to multiply by 2 to get 4. And whatever you do, I'm not going to choose something other than yellow, sorry. Whatever you do to the bottom is what you do to the top when you're looking for equivalent fractions. So if I'm multiplying my denominator by 2 to get 4, then I must multiply my numerator by 2 as well. That'll give you what your numerator is. Okay? Let's think about what we're doing here. How can I go, what am I going to multiply 2 by to get 6? I'm going to use the number 3. Whatever I do to the bottom, I must do to the top. This is how we find equivalent fractions. So essentially what this means is 1/2 is the same as or equal to 3/6. 1/2 is the same as or equal to 2/4. 1/2 is the same as or equal to 4/8. How am I getting from 2 to 8? I need to multiply by 4. And whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top. And 1/2 is also equal to 5/10. Whatever I do to the bottom, so 2 times 5 will give me 10. I must do to the top. So these are all equivalent fractions. Okay, let's look at how that happens. And they're equivalent because if we were to put them on that grid that we were looking at, that pyramid, they would be taking up the same amount of space. Okay, so how am I getting from 4 to 8? I multiply by 2. Oops. And then obviously 1 times 2 is also 2. How am I getting from 4 to 12? You need to multiply by 3. And again, whatever you do to the bottom, you do to the top. So all of these are equivalent to 1/4. Multiply by 4 to get 16. And 1 times 4 is 4. And finally, what are you multiplying by 4 to get 20? That's right, 5. And you've had to multiply 1 by 5 to get 5 as well. Okay, so these are equivalent fractions. 2/8 is equal to 1/4. 3/12 is equal to 1/4. 4/16 is equal to 1/4. And 5/20 is equal to 1/4. This fraction is a representation of all of these. Because it is the smallest, it is called the fraction in lowest terms. It cannot be any lower than that. Let's put that over here. Lowest terms. Guys, on Wednesday, you're welcome to come and do a chat with me, an online chat, if you have any questions about any of these. Okay? I do also recommend that you look online for some fraction strips, or for this pyramid, I'll go back to it and show you one more time. something like this to show you equivalent fractions. If you type into your Google search and look for an image of equivalent fractions, this will pop up. I'm going to, however, show you, we just did this over here, but I'm going to show you how you can do it without looking at a fraction strip. Fraction strips are really good to show understanding of how they take up the same amount of space, but I want to show you with math as well. So again, we talked about what you do to the bottom, you do to the top. So in order to figure out how you get from 4 to 8 as a denominator, you need to think about what numbers you can multiply together. So if I multiply 4 by 2, I will get 8. If I do that, if I multiply those at the bottom, I must do that to the top. Okay, that will give me 2/8. If I multiply 4 times 3 to give me 12, then I must multiply my numerator by 3 as well. Whatever I do to the bottom, I must do to the top to give me an equivalent fraction. Okay? If I'm multiplying 4 by a number to give me 16, I'm going to come up with the number 4. 1 times 4 is also 4. So you're always looking for a number you can multiply your original fractions by to give you another fraction. 4 times 5, and whatever I do to the bottom, I must do to the top. Okay, so that's how you can do it without looking at fraction strips. Let's find some equivalent fractions for 1/5. Okay, I'm going to give you, I want you to pause the video right now and come up with some fractions for 1/5. I will start you off. I'm going to multiply 5 by 2. And whatever I do to the bottom, I must do to the top. So my equivalent fraction for 1/5 is going to be 1 times 2 is 2, and 5 times 2 is 10. So my first equivalent fraction is 2/10. Okay, so I want you doing a few more to come up with equivalent fractions for the family of 1/5. So pause the video and come up with some. All right, thank you for taking a pause. We could have done 1/5 times 3 and times 3 to give us 1 times 3 is 3, and 5 times 3 is 15. This is also equal. We could have done 1/5 times 4. So whatever I do to the bottom, I do to the top. Four twentieths, and so on and so forth. Oops. Bear with me, sorry. Thank you, Joshua. 4/20. Okay, so again, you're just coming up with a number that you're multiplying your denominator and your numerator by. As long as these two are equal and your math is correct, this is an equivalent fraction. I want you looking at your fingers. Hold them out in front of you. This is a good way to look at 1/2 being equivalent to 5/10. So hold out all 10 fingers. All together, you have 10 fingers. Half of those are 5/10. Okay, so on 2 hands, you have 10 fingers. Only one of your hand, there are 5 fingers. Okay, so that's a way of looking at equivalent fractions. Okay, I'm going to give you some work on equivalent fractions, guys. Don't worry about this page. And it is going to lead into our next lesson about lowest common denominators, which should be review for you grade 6s.